Right, let's now take you to the National Results Operations Centre in Pretoria, where we find my co-anchors, Ayanda, Nyathi and Michelle Craig. Alongside them is our senior politics reporter, Ziyanda Ngcobo. Michelle and Ayanda, very good morning to you. Of course, the big talking point as we wait for these results to start trickling in is voter turnout.
Absolutely. Good morning to you, Mpho. We're live from the floor of the results center, the central station, if you like, where all the information is essentially being collated. And you're absolutely right. So much conversation the morning after about how many people actually rocked up to cast their ballot. In the lead up to yesterday, there had been all kinds of discussions around the context in which this election is also taking place. For one, it's happening, as we know, during the global health crisis, but more specifically for our context here in South Africa, this is the first election that was held on a Monday, creating a dynamic that wasn't really conducive for a lot of people to actually rock up at the polls. But you're right, I'm not alone. The person who is watching all the moving parts as it happens is Ziyanda Ngcobo. She's our senior politics reporter here on Newzroom Afrika, joining us on the floor. And Ziyanda, it's always so lovely chatting to you. And what a moment to be in this country, right? So we are reflecting on what has taken place so far.
Yes.
And even though not all the puzzle pieces are together, one thing is clear. Not as many people actually rocked up yesterday.
Absolutely, and one of the factors that has led to this is, of course, that many people saw, Monday as a long weekend. And unlike a national general election where you're able to vote wherever in the country, you needed to be in your specific ward to cast your vote. And it's very interesting that the IEC, when asked to give a comparative analysis of by 12:30 during the 2016 local government elections, where did the numbers stand? Because during the 1 o'clock update, they told us that 3.5 million South Africans had cast their vote. During the 8 o'clock briefing that the IEC gave, it was sitting at around 8 million. That's around 23% or so of the vote. So how much by the time it was 8 o'clock had South Africans voted? Right. Their reasoning, Ayanda, has been to say that they're using a new voter management device which gives them data in real time, so they'll only be able to do it during the next election. But I think to a certain extent it's also really to avoid admitting that the voter turnout this time around was quite poor. And in fact, one of the questions that the journalists asked during that late night briefing was whether or not the IEC believes that they need to take responsibility in some shape, way or form for the lack of voter turnout, for people not really wanting to come out and vote, against the backdrop of voter apathy that you and I have spoken about for a very long time, just going into these elections, Ayanda.
Absolutely. You referenced that late night briefing started at around 8 o'clock yesterday. Initially, it was meant to be 7.
It was meant to be 6 o'clock, actually.
We'll read into that what we will. It does give us an idea that even the IEC, in some instance, is learning as we go along. But let's actually break down some of the takeaways from that briefing yesterday, which I imagine a lot of people watching now may have missed. Voter turnout certainly stood out as one of the issues. The devices that you've referenced was another issue, but there was instances where people were also reporting not actually being on the roll at a respective voting station when they rocked up to vote, despite having it registered.
And I think that's going to be the key issue that the IEC is going to have to address this morning, Ayanda. What happened to those people who, during the registration drive in September, had actually updated their details, but when they arrived at their particular voting stations, they were told that they're not appearing. We heard Dr. Nomsama Soko speaking about this MEC7 form that the IEC uses to deal with these matters. But however, there was a question to say there are many instances where South Africans were turned around and really, how else would you be able to get them back to their voting stations once you've resolved those particular issues that pertain to them being actually at that particular voting station's voters' roll. There was also an issue about ballots as well, Ayanda. Other instances, there were reports that there aren't enough ballots. The IEC addressed that during the 1 o'clock briefing. But again, during the evening briefing, there was still this issue about the stuffing stuffing of ballots. In KwaZulu-Natal, an official, a presiding officer was fired. We know in Moretele, in the northwest, there was also an instance where a closed ballot box was opened by an official. And I'm mentioning these examples because it would seem that even within the IEC, some of their own presiding officers, they didn't get training. Because in the instance where a ballot box was open that had already been closed, it's allegedly because, a citizen went up and said they'd made a mistake, and then the ballot box was open.
Wow.
What happened then to the votes that were already in that box? And for those people who had already voted, because you won't know who had actually voted in which manner. So these are some of the issues, I think, that the IEC, as these results start to trickle in, and Ayanda, I think if we turn to my left, we're now sitting at 10% of the national leading party by awards. To your right is where they're doing the provincial numbers that are currently sitting at 4%. So as those numbers come in, and you would have heard Mawetu Mosri actually saying that from 7 o'clock, I think the pace will start picking up.
Yeah.
But really, until they're able to deal with these issues, including the one with the Change Party, you'll recall where they had their PR councillor list had their name, but they had their logo of the party rather, but the name next to the logo was not the same.
Wow.
So these are some of the issues that the IEC will really, again, I think this morning, have to clarify so that South Africans are not sitting there with question marks about the legitimacy and the credibility of this election.
Absolutely, and that's not what you need at this stage. In fact, the IEC unequivocally apologizing to the Change Party yesterday for that error on the ballot paper. But I want to speak a bit more detail, if we can, Ziyanda, to what we're seeing now. And to be frank, we're making sense of the numbers with you because they are being updated slightly. We are expecting that massive big update at around 7 o'clock, but the last update actually came in at 5:10. And so far, as Ziyanda has mentioned, 10% of all the vote counting has already taken place. It's frankly not enough to determine this vote just yet.
No, it's not enough to determine this vote, and I think, Ayanda, going back then to that issue of the voter turnout, it's also going to be an indictment of the political landscape in the country that if we have the lowest levels of a voter turnout in this election, what does that say about our political parties? What does that say about how South Africans view this democracy and being able to effect change through the ballot box? This is also really an accountability aspect of it. But will political parties rise to the occasion is what I'm asking myself this morning as we still really tell this story of a low voter turnout. Why did it happen? Surely it cannot just be about, it being a long weekend and many people traveling. There are some fundamental issues that South Africans are clearly demonstrating by not showing up at the polling stations.
Absolutely. The levels of disillusionment, even as you and I were in the streets yesterday, were quite evident.
Yeah.
But the list of problems doesn't end there for the IEC. 20 stations in KwaZulu-Natal and the Free State not being able to open yesterday because of unrest.
Yes, it was KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape.
Right.
In KwaZulu-Natal, it was as a result of a dispute, in particular, Mkambatini in KwaZulu-Natal's Midlands, where they're having issues with their traditional leadership. Now, I find it quite curious that by the time voting day came, that these issues weren't resolved, because on Saturday, when I was here, the same area of Camperdown in KwaZulu-Natal was an issue where the special votes were also interrupted for the exact same reasons. In the Eastern Cape, there were also community protests that also caused a delay in the open of the voting stations. But by the time it was the afternoon, the IEC said, according to them, that all those voting stations, albeit them opening late, had actually managed to open on time. Again, though, in the evening briefing, there was still question marks as to whether or not the IEC would be extending the hours for those particular voting stations. I think at best the response that we got was that if you are already in the queue by the time the clock strikes 9 o'clock, you would not be turned around. So there's also that issue, coupled with what we spoke about earlier on about those who had actually gone and updated their details, during the voter registration drive weekend, and then yesterday not being able to cast their vote.
Sure. So much to think about. It's still the very early hours of the morning after this election. Ziyanda Ngcobo, for now, thanks very much indeed, Ziyanda, our senior politics reporter here on Newzroom Afrika, as we continue making sense of the numbers as they trickle in. Once again, only 10% of the national vote being counted so far. The ANC and the DA seem to be leading with the most number of ward seats, but the picture can change very, very drastically within the hours to come. In fact, Michelle, who's inside our studio here at The Rock, 8 million was the number that the IEC gave to us in terms of how many people actually rocked up by, I think, 6 p.m. yesterday.
Yeah. I mean, the numbers are shocking, and a very good morning to our viewers, live to you here from the Results Operations Center. Let me begin by apologizing for my voice. It's just a bit of a sore throat, but voter turnout is going to be a major factor in these elections. If we think back to 2016, the voter turnout then, actually we saw record numbers, about 58% turnout in the 2016 local government elections. Let's not also forget the context in which these elections are taking place. In terms of COVID-19 and our own fight against the pandemic, it takes place in the strange place between the third and fourth wave of infections. One wonders how much COVID-19 and government's handling of the pandemic here in South Africa would have played into how voters cast their ballots in various wards, districts and municipalities yesterday. Let's also not forget that we've had an incredibly busy and eventful year in our country so far. Just think back a few months ago to the insurrection we saw in parts of Johannesburg and in KZN, the violence and looting in those provinces, ostensibly sparked by the arrest, the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma. Let's also not forget, as we talk about COVID-19, what unfolded insofar as whistleblower Babita Deokaran was concerned. She was assassinated. She was exposing COVID-19 corruption, particularly as it was taking place in Gauteng. The other big issue, yesterday we were talking about some voting stations losing power, parts of Randburg in Johannesburg without electricity for several hours yesterday. The rolling blackouts that we saw in the lead up to these local government elections. The African National Congress, at least the polling suggesting that it's going to pay quite dearly insofar as its handling of load shedding and Eskom and SOEs is concerned in the country. The other big issue, unemployment numbers in our country, 34.4%. That's only the official number. Under the expanded definition of unemployment, that number rises to 44.4%. 7.8 million people in our country are unemployed, and the vast majority of those people are indeed young. They are the youth of the country who face massive unemployment in our country. Gender-based violence, another big theme throughout these local government elections. This is just some of the context under which South Africa went to the polls just yesterday. As we've been saying, the voter turnout, early indications, that was by about 6 p.m. yesterday, 26% voter turnout. Did we see a big push in the lead up to voting stations closing by 9 o'clock last night? Can we see that number pushing the 58% that we saw back in 2016? These are all the issues we're going to be unpacking for you from our live position here at the Results Operations Center in Pretoria, the heartbeat of the IEC. As those numbers start coming in, we'll bring it to you live on Channel 405. For now, it's back to you in Randburg.
Thanks, Michelle. Absolutely very important elements there in the build-up to the local government elections, and of course the determining factor as we focus our attention on voter turnout and some of those really important elements to consider.